The Threads of Fate. Game changing or lackluster? Or even, what the hell is it? Today we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into what the Threads of Fate mechanic is and how it pans out to use. So let's dive into it. So let's start with what is the Threads of Fate. Now, the Threads of Fate is an alt leveling mechanic that appears for the first time in Shadowlands. And essentially what it is that when you arrive on your alt having already attained max level and completed the storyline progression for the 4 main zones on your main, you will on your alt be met with a choice upon arriving in Oribos after the initial section in the Maw. This choice has you pick either to level the exact same way that you did on your main or to use the Threads of Fate. The Threads of Fate will automatically give you story completion in the 4 main leveling zones and allow you instead to level via doing world quests and doing dungeons and doing bonus objectives. You will also be able to do side quests, however you will not be able to do the main storyline as of course these quests are already flagged as completed. There are massive perks and massive cons to doing either one, so that is going to be something that we discuss later on in the video, but for now that is a general understanding of what the Threads of Fate are. Now just before we dive into the pros and cons that we just mentioned, there is a really important piece of information that you need to know before you make this decision on any given character. And that is that if you are to select to progress on the Threads of Fate route for leveling your alt, this decision is final, as once those storyline quests are marked as completed, there is no going back. However, if you are to level on your main story progression like you did with your main, then you will be able to pick the Threads of Fate at a later moment to begin from that point of completion when you have already progressed some of the story yourself. Now, this is going to have some interactions with what I recommend for certain characters in certain situations later on in the video, but for now, let's dive into the pros and cons of using Threads of Fate or leveling conventionally. Now, the first thing that we're going to see as a perk to the Threads of Fate is going to be the dropping of the linearity of the Shadowlands leveling experience. If you have leveled your character to level 60, then you will know that the storyline progression is very much a linear progression of one giant quests chain for the completion of your campaign. Now, while there is the opportunity to break off and do other things if you should so like, this is going to just prove to be inefficient because when you get to max level you will need to have completed that linear progression storyline anyway, whereas with the Threads of Fate that is no longer an option as it is completed for you. The next big perk is going to be the opening up of world quests. Now, world quests are going to provide you with experience on your leveling progression, but also provide you with rewards just like a world quest normally would. Some world quests do provide bonus experience, some provide gear, and rather notably and quite surprisingly from my perspective is also going to be that some world quests provide you with anima. Now, anima is of course what we need to be spending a lot of our time at max level gathering in these early stages of Shadowlands, and it's going to be used for a lot of things in your Covenant Sanctum. Now, one thing that is going to be of note here is that you won't actually be able to deposit this anima and use it until you achieve level 60, but you will be able to gather it from world quest sources. Now, in my experience so far, it has been some relatively small amounts of anima that is available, but that is also true at maximum level, so getting a jump start on this could be a big perk to sell people on leveling via the Threads of Fate comparative to conventional leveling. Now, the next and final of the major changes that you're going to see from Threads of Fate comparative to conventional leveling is the fact that you will be picking your Covenant from the moment that you select to do the Threads of Fate leveling method. Now, you can still experiment with the Covenants in the Oribos section where you'll perform the quest that has you select your Covenant, but you will be picking straight away without having used these in a live environment during your questing time. If you already have your mind made up as to what Covenant you want to pick, fantastic, and that is going to be something that's going to benefit you greatly. However, if you are somebody who is going to want to experiment with all of the covenants to know what one you want to pick, perhaps the conventional leveling method is going to be better for you. Now, the last thing that I want to mention as a change from the conventional leveling is what replaces the story quest in terms of your progression with your campaign. Now, of course, when you can finish the story campaign on conventional leveling, you go into an extension of your campaign that works for your covenants. Now, you aren't able to do your covenant development, as it were, until you hit maximum level when using Threads of Fate. So what takes its place? Essentially, it's going to be a series of what's very similar to your callings, and you are going to have a calling, as it were, that you need to complete for each of the zones. Now, you pick which zone you are going to want to do your first, second, third, and fourth in. You do select the options. However, you will have to pick one and then complete a bar in that zone before moving on to the next, and you will need to do all 4 of your Threads of Fate callings, as I'm calling them, in order to be able to progress with your campaign upon achieving level 60. Now, this does mean that you're still going to have some linearity in terms of what you're doing with Threads of Fate. Going from one zone to another on a whim is not going to be particularly efficient for you. You are going to want to spend your entire time in one zone to complete this before moving on to the next. The only difference being you get to pick the order of the zones that you progress through. Now, you do get a massive chunk of experience and some nice rewards for completing one of these areas, and you can complete this quest by doing a wide variety of activities, from world quests, dungeons, rares, treasures, basically absolutely anything in that zone will provide you with some degree of fulfillment in the bar that you need for the completing of this quest, but you are still limited to being in one zone at a time for the terms of completing this quest. Now, I think that last point leads us nicely into looking into the cons of using the Threads of Fate. Now, the first thing that you're going to notice using Threads of Fate is that you just simply aren't going to level as quickly, or at least in my experience, nowhere near as quickly as you would from leveling conventionally with the storyline. Say what you will about linearity, but it does mean that you can have a very easy to follow, highly congested leveling experience with quests back to back that are just giving you non-stop experience, and it's very efficient. On the other hand, when left to your own devices and given that freedom, you will find yourself perhaps not being able to plan as efficient routes, or world quests not quite being where you want, or simply just running out of things to do. Now, not in the sense that there won't be enough to complete your bars that you need to fill for each given zone, but certainly in the sense that you will be having to do every single scrap of things that are on there. So if there is a world quest that you don't like, or if there is, so perhaps, for example, I had one for pet battling, which is something that I normally skim over when it comes to the world quest options, you are probably going to find yourself wanting to do absolutely everything on the map in order to be at least somewhat efficient. And the bars that you need to fill for what I'm dubbing those callings are going to be very slow to fill. Now, that is going to be the second con that I have for this method. Because of the fact they want you to basically spend a lot of time in these zones, these seem to be tuned so that you're going to have to do a rather massive amount in order to fill the bar for any given zone. And I would be okay with this if you could have all 4 simultaneously. I think that would be a fantastic change that would make this system considerably better, but it isn't something you're going to be able to do. So in my testing, as you'll notice from this footage, I picked Bastion because it's my favourite zone. But when I found out that I couldn't have all 4 of these bars to fill at the same time, it really put me off from doing dungeons, which is one of the things that they even list when you're selecting these options as a way of leveling. This is because I'm basically forced to make a choice. I can either choose to level through specific dungeons and make sure that I get the dungeon in the zone that I want for filling one of these bars, or I can choose to go for the random dungeon, get the bonus experience, but risk only not getting one of the dungeons that is in a zone I can't fill a bar for. And when you consider that when you're using this method, there will be 4 dungeons available to you, 1 in each of the zones, you only have a 25% chance of hitting the dungeon that you want to be able to get both the bonus experience and also your bar completion. Now, this would be simply fixed if you were able to pick all 4 of the zones to do simultaneously. You aren't obviously going to be able to do quests and things in all 4 zones at the same time because, well, your character can only be in one place at once, but it just means that using dungeons is going to be more of a viable option for you. The dungeons don't even fill up the bar that quickly, so it's not as though you're going to have a problem with people filling the bar and not achieving level 60. This is going to be something that I feel is going to put a lot of people off from Threads of Fate because, well, you are going to find yourself in a zone just doing the same things that you would be doing anyway, or at least feeling like it, but without the efficiency of getting to max level any quicker. Now, there is also an issue with regards to the scaling. Now, not in the sense that it's broken, but more in the sense that it works. Now, if you let me elaborate on that, if you're going in with a very well-geared alt into Shadowlands, then you will find that when you are in the Bastion zone at least, you are basically going to fly through it. Now, I can't honestly say that I have been able to assess accurately how much the scaling affects the gear of characters and how quickly it ramps up when you are leveling through the Threads of Fate, as all of my alts are rather poorly geared. However, I am given to understand that even if you are in the Bastion zone, leveling conventionally, then you will have a easier time than if you immediately activate the Threads of Fate and go to the Bastion zone. This means that you are going to have an option whereby you may be making your character weaker by what you are choosing to do as a leveling method. Now, this is something of a double-edged sword, and it leads us nicely into the next section of this video, which is going to be my recommendations. Now, what should you pick to do as your method of leveling? Now, it's not actually as straightforward a decision as it might seem. There are a lot of considerations, so let's get the simple ones out of the way first. If you really enjoyed the Shadowlands story, or maybe if, like me, you didn't really pay all that much attention to it because you were more focused the first time around on getting there as quickly as you possibly could because you're excited for the new expansion, then probably going to want to pick to level conventionally so you can see all of that story again. Similarly, if you're someone who couldn't care less about the story and actually find all of the cinematics just get in the way of your gameplay experience, then you may want to do the opposite and pick the Threads of Fate. That's the first consideration and a relatively simple one to understand for anybody. The next one, however, is going to be your gear level going into Shadowlands. Now, there is obviously a benefit to having gear no matter what way you choose to level. However, I would say that you are going to benefit the most from your gear in the early stages of conventional leveling comparative to if you were to level through the Threads of Fate due to how the scaling seems to work. Now, this does need more testing in order to get conclusive proof and is of course something that can be tuned at any given moment. But it certainly does feel to me as though you would benefit more if you have a geared character by leveling conventionally. Now, another thing to consider is going to be the class and spec that you are leveling. Now, of course, every class has a DPS spec, which is generally considered to be the best role to have when you are trying to level conventionally. However, if you simply despise the spec of the DPS that you are playing and you really enjoy, let's say, for example, Protection Warrior, then I feel sorry for you in Shadowlands, but if you really do want to play Protection Warrior and you despise Arms and Fury, then chances are you're going to be better off leveling through the Threads of Fate, as you will be doing more dungeon content, and therefore you will be able to get to play via the protection role that you enjoy. There is of course nothing stopping you from doing the dungeons in a conventional manner and then simply having all of your storyline quests completed by choosing the Threads of Fate at a later time. And this is going to lead me nicely onto my final recommendation and the points to consider for it, which is going to be, why not have the best of both worlds? Now, if you are coming into Shadowlands with a well-geared alt, as I've already said, I highly recommend leveling through the conventional means, at least for the early zones that your gear will massively outperform. But as I alluded to earlier in the video, there's nothing stopping you doing, let's say, Bastion and maybe Maldraxxus while you're well-geared, and then simply activating the Threads of Fate at a later time. Now, this would allow you to get the maximum benefit out of your gear, but still then also be able to get a lot of experience leveling that way, and then finally enter the Threads of Fate, get the story completion done, and not have as far to go to 60. This seems to be the best way, in my opinion, of attaining the maximum efficiency for both leveling and enjoyment, as well as getting the most out of your character. So, if you are a class that levels very powerfully, and you want to enjoy the story, by all means level conventionally. If you are more of a support role class and you don't really like playing your class out in the open world by yourself and you want to level via the dungeons, then maybe you want to go for the Threads of Fate, or maybe simply if you want to get your anima to store up, then Threads of Fate might be the option for you. However, my final recommendation for this video is probably going to be that everyone should level at least part way through the story, and then move into the Threads of Fate at a later point when their character's power coming in from the previous expansion has expired as such, and they've already seen at least the part of the story they want to play through, with Bastion and Maldraxxus often being considered some of the nicer zones, and then of course you could experience the other two via the World Quest system from the Threads of Fate. Now by all means, if one stands out more preferable to you, there is absolutely no right or wrong answer here, but just remember that the Threads of Fate is a final decision, whereas leveling conventionally is something that you can change your mind from. So if you are on the fence, then I would probably recommend leveling conventionally and then deciding at a later point if you wish to change. But that's going to about wrap it up for this video, guys. I do hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do let me know down below and consider subscribing to the channel. But for now, guys, I hope to see you in the next one. Later.